one point, Lewis was telling another person in the book that you made up about Arthur's thinking about philanthropy, and it's the beehive story, which I think is related to what you know. It's not utopian; it's realistic. Each should play their own role, but tell us the beehive story of.
I'd love to, and especially because, as you know, Michael and Dan, it's so relevant to our modern philanthropy. Modern philanthropy, everyone says you got to go to scale. You know, there's all these MBA jargon terms. You've got to get big. You've got to have metrics and scale up. It just gives me the willies. I mean, the great philanthropy of all time, it was the opposite. It was small is beautiful. You start at the very lower level with individual human beings. You understand them as individuals, not as part of a big blob. I'm not a white, this XYZ an American. I have my own distinctive qualities. You have your own distinctive qualities. Everyone does. And if you want to influence and change them, you've got to begin to understand those. So the Tappans were big on the idea of small scale work, because they understood that if everyone does their little bit and gardens their backyard and makes it beautiful, pretty soon the whole village looks great. And so that's the beehive metaphor. So beehives are so fascinating. Imagine the amount of nectar that a bee can carry on those little cups that he has on his legs. It's minuscule. I did the math for this when I was working on the novel. It's just tiny. It takes about 1 million miles of flying to make a teaspoonful of honey. And if you think about that, you say, oh my gosh, that's a crazy amount of work. I can't ever produce a pound of honey that way. I'm going to just give up. But that's defeatist thinking. And the Tappans recognize that if every bee, me starting with me, and including my neighbor, and including the next ring out, and then the next ring out, if everyone does their little bit, by the end of the day, you've got this hive full of honey. And that was a metaphor that was not only poetic and lovely, but really very realistic. And that's the way a lot of their great work got done. Not by big foundations, not by big corporations, not by big government, not by big anything, but by lots and lots of small individuals doing their part.
How did Lewis and Arthur make the money they gave away through philanthropy, and why didn't Benjamin make any?
Well, that's actually fascinating. I had as much fun telling the kind of the non-philanthropic side of the story, because these guys were just doers, and they basically made their money in the silk trade, which gave me a chance to jump onto these clipper ships that were going to China and to India to import this silk for the very first time. Intrinsically romantic storytelling, all kinds of fascinating things. And Arthur and Lewis were right at the heart of that. They were this golden era when America began to beat the Europeans at their own game of trading overseas and bringing back profits. And when American women discovered silk, they thought it was a miracle. I mean, it's not just a gewgaw. It's not just a luxury. It's actually a very practical product. It's extremely tough. It washes well. It's warm. And American women just fell in love with silk, couldn't get enough of it. So Arthur jumped in there and said, I'm going to try to become the preeminent dealer in silks. And everyone laughed, because he was this old gray, kind of never wore anything but black clothes, Puritan head, no interest in flash himself. But he said, well, look, if this is going to be a big thing, let's do it the right way. So, for instance, the amazing thing he did as a businessman was he invented the Walmart slogan of, one low price every day. That's really what Arthur did. And you say, well, that can't possibly be new. Actually, it is. Up until that time, almost all the merchant selling in New York City and elsewhere was done by haggling. So you go in and you say, I want to buy this much. What'll you give it to me for? And you can instantly sense the power imbalance there. If you're a small buyer, you're not influential, your name doesn't start with Lady Macbeth, you're not going to get the same deal. Arthur said, that's not fair. That's not even a Christian principle. I'm just going to have one price. It's going to be a low price. I will advertise it. I will guarantee it. If you write me from New Orleans and say you want me to send you stuff, I will do it and promise that I will pick out the goods as well as if I were going to buy them myself. And this shocked everybody. All the other merchants said, you can't do that. That's going to be a huge failure. But he did do it, made a huge amount of money. At one point, he was one of the richest men in New York as a result of this innovation. And they did other things. For instance, Lewis entirely, single-handedly invented the business of credit reporting. And again, that sounds kind of boring, but if you are making the transition to a continental country for the very first time, and somebody in Rhode Island wants to sell something to somebody in St. Louis, how do you know they're going to be good for it? You've got to have some sort of a basis. So recognizing this, Lewis set up the whole industry of credit reporting. His firm became what's today Dun & Bradstreet. Other things, the brothers together developed what really was the prototype for the modern high quality newspaper. There were like 25 newspapers in New York City when they were there, but they were all trash, unbelievable yellow journalism, name calling, really just vicious. And Arthur said, let's have a real quality paper that has good economic news, that has cultural stuff, that has religious discussion, that has book reviews. And they actually did this. And again, even there were innovations within the innovations. To give you a quick example, they realized that one of the best scoops that any newspaper can get is to connect with one of the ships coming in from the South Seas or China or in England or Japan before anyone else does and get the latest gossip. Oh my gosh, the English king has abdicated, or oh my gosh, there's been a huge storm that wiped out the cocoa crop and I had no idea. And that was valuable intel. So they hired two little fast ships and they sent them a couple days off of New York City. They'd stop these incoming boats from abroad. They'd give them some bribes and some newspapers and some fresh fruit and, shoot the breeze with them. They'd get the gossip and race back to New York and get this into print before anyone else did. It was a massive leg up. So this is the kind of guys these were. They're very inventive, creative businessmen.
Karl, if in this technically advanced era we're in on streaming, if Fox came to you after looking at the novel and said, look, this is the script that we'd like to take, is there well, we can use a sort of a political philosophy, was there a moment of higher consciousness for the three of them, not necessarily sitting in the same room, but contemporaneous, where they came to an understanding through an experience? I don't want to say a 9/11 moment, but something that crystallized, if you were, again, putting this in a script for a streaming 5-episode Fox series. Is there something that people that are going to read the novel would go to and say, yeah, aha, there is something which explains this sort of Jacksonian, neo-puritanical view of the world that would awaken other consciousness?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I hope there will be a script. The book has been optioned for streaming, production as a streaming. And there's a huge amount that goes into that, as you know. So, who knows if we'll actually fight our way through Hollywood. But my only point in saying that is the story is intrinsically cinematic enough that, a producer out in Hollywood said, wow, I'd like to think about trying this. So please, from our lips to God's ears, may this actually happen. But to answer your question, yeah, there was a big, big moment. You haven't gotten to it. It's at the end of the book, Dan. So, but again, I don't want to give away too much, but some of our listeners may remember that there was a massive controversy when Texas came into the Union.
That's
right. For years, Congress had been really careful. We're not going to expand slavery. If we let in one slave state, we're going to let in a free state to balance them so that they don't take over the Senate, blah, blah, blah. And it was ugly and it was never really super successful, but they kept the rough equivalents. At one point, the president sitting in the White House pulled a fast one and negotiated a treaty to bring in Texas as a slave state with no conditions, no balancing state, no timeline for getting rid of slavery in the next 10 years, nothing. And this obviously sent Lewis and Arthur over the edge, but more importantly, it sent Benjamin over the edge. He said, this is not the way America works. You don't do secret dead of the night treaties to make a major decision like that without informing the American people. So Benjamin at that point was a sitting senator. And the treaty that the president had negotiated with the Mexicans and the Brits and the Texans was given to them in secret. They said, please meet in secret session and vote this through. And Benjamin leaked a copy to his brother, sent an express rider to New York City, and got it published in the New York Post overnight. And the country went nuts. They said, you can't do this. And so it was a dead letter. Now, Benjamin got basically kicked out of his party as a result of that. But that was the moment, Dan, when the brothers realized we're on the same team. Slavery is not only abusing a whole portion of the American population, it's corroding our basic liberties. People are now sneaking around. They're doing things illicitly. The other piece of this that just drove Benjamin nuts was Calhoun, who at that point was the Secretary of State, as part of this treaty with the Brits, treaty with the Texans, wrote a letter to the Brits and said, who were threatening to get involved in this, he said, don't you dare touch this. The American people love slavery, more or less, is what he said. And Benjamin's position had always been slavery stinks. I'm from Ohio, a non-slave state. I don't want anything to do with slavery, but I also don't want to tell the Southerners what to do. I'll hold my nose and live with it because that's what my Democrat Party requires to remain in the ascendancy. But when Calhoun went that extra step and didn't just say that the Southerners want slavery, he said, all of us Americans believe slavery is salutary for the country and salutary for Black Americans. He said, you're speaking out of school. That is not true. And you must never do that. So he again realized that the slave owning impulse was becoming a kind of, it was creating an aristocracy that thought they could tell the rest of the country what to do. And they just both went ballistic at that point. That was heartbreaking for Benjamin. He basically had to say, my whole life is wasted. I was on the wrong team. But they made the most of it. They managed to come together. Benjamin formed a group of what he called free Democrats, Democrats against slavery. And the Tappans finally decided, who had always eschewed politics, thought politics was kind of dirty and not really the best way to proceed. They said, okay, I'll work with Benjamin. We'll create a little successor to the Whig Party that's dying off. And those two pieces from the left and from the right came together to form the Republican Party. And it gave us Lincoln.
So, Karl, and this might be the last question, who might be or could be or should be, and you can even appeal to categories if not actual names, no name, who'd be a philanthropic Tappan of today or philanthropic Tappans?
I hate to end on a downer, but I got to go back to where we were talking a few minutes ago about, kind of modern philanthropy having become this kind of technocratic, bloodless impulse. Let's acknowledge how far we are from the wisdom of the Tappans. Instead of that kind of that moral impulse, that one-on-one impulse, that personal suasion impulse, that working with the inner soul that made the Tappans so successful, we're in the opposite place right now. And a lot of this, let's be frank, is because the biggest fortunes of our era are coming out of technology, right? So these techies think, oh, that's the solution to computers. That must also be the solution to addiction. That must also be the solution to family breakdown. So they're prescribing technology and engineering and reprogramming human beings. And it's never going to work. We are so far from the human elements that really matter. Leo Tolstoy said something I love. He said, everyone talks about changing the world. And you certainly hear this all the time from, again, the big techie philanthropists. Let's change the world. I know how to change the world. Everyone talks about changing the world, but nobody talks about changing themselves or helping other people change their selves. And the Tappan said, that's the real work. It's not about some sort of external circumstance. It's about changing ourselves, having a different attitude toward life, and a different, it's kind of self-discipline and respect for our neighbors. And so, again, I'm not going to give you a nice answer there, Mike, other than to say that I fear we're really on the wrong track. And until we get on this other track, that's much more of a personal approach, much more of a moral approach, much more of a persuasion approach, I don't think we're going to get much headway against these things that are really eating at us today, like addiction and family breakdown and aggression toward neighbors.
Well, that's okay, Karl, because we have it's a secret, unstated tradition, which I'll now just acknowledge here on our Giving Review conversations. We're not skittish about ending on a negative note. But you did have some positivity in there in your of looking inward, really. But
Mike, we don't mind being Jansenists.
So why don't we finish it up there? Oh, go ahead, Karl. Yep.
Well, the good news is, this can change fast. It changed fast in fact, here's a bit of positivity. Let me end on this positive note. Everyone thinks, oh, woe is me. We've got these horrible problems today. You see what's happening on the streets of San Francisco. You see with the crime wage. You see the fact that literally majority of children grow up without their father in the household. These are depressing and worrisome things. Well, I got news for you, folks. It was worse in Jacksonian America. Jacksonian America was a brutal, really harsh time. I told you that alcohol consumption was 3 or 4 times the current rate. The sex trafficking was a serious problem. Half of the kids didn't get any schooling. There was all kinds of violence. Just promiscuous violence. There was a thing called gouging, where guys would grow their fingernails so they could pop the eyeball out of someone when they were fighting on the street. It was just a really raw time. And I'm sure nobody saw it coming when the Second Great Awakening swept the country, that there could be this complete inversion where all of a sudden people would be taking responsibility for their own failures and trying to take responsibility to help their neighbors as well. So the Tappans and their many, many, many allies exploded onto the scene basically through a change of mind. It wasn't because there was a new economy. It wasn't because an asteroid hit. It was just because people changed their minds and said, we want to live differently. So that can happen again. Principle is always more interesting to prescribe than, oh, we got to win a world war or we've got to double our GDP. Those things are hard, but we can change our minds on principle tomorrow if we decide enough is enough. We want to do things differently.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Karl, for doing this with us. Karl Zinsmeister, author of the new historical novel, The Brothers.
Thank you.